The Beck Fine Arts Group gala smelled like white peonies and old money, hothouse flowers flown in that morning, champagne poured by staff trained never to let a glass sit empty for more than 90 seconds. Outside the glass atrium, autumn had turned Seoul the color of rust and wet stone, and inside, 300 of the city's collectors, critics, and old-name families moved through the lobby beneath a Beck family calligraphy scroll so large it had its own security detail.
Is my name on the list? I'm sorry, sir, it is not.
The old man in the worn gray hanbok didn't make it past the second set of doors. Invitation, sir. The guard didn't look up from his tablet. Behind him, a line of black cars kept disgorging silk and tailored wool onto the red carpet. I don't need one, the old man said, quietly, the way you say something you've said 100 times and stopped expecting to be believed. This is a private event. The guard's tone flattened further, the particular flatness reserved for people assumed to be a problem before they'd done anything. You'll have to step back from the entrance. A woman in a beaded gown glanced over, made a small sound of distaste, and steered her date around him like he was a puddle. Someone's laugh carried from the champagne table, not about him, probably, but it landed on him anyway, the way stray laughter always finds the person already bracing for it. The old man's hand tightened on the strap of a canvas bag slung across his shoulder. He didn't argue. He simply started to turn, already leaving before anyone could make him leave, his shoulders folding in the particular way of a man who'd had a great deal of practice disappearing quietly. That should have been the end of it. Excuse me. Simone Carter came around the security line at a half jog, heels catching on the carpet's edge, the strap of her bag slipping down one arm. She'd been in the building 4 hours cataloging condition reports for tomorrow's unveiling and had exactly 11 minutes to change before she was expected on the floor. She didn't have time for this, and some part of her clocked that fact and did it anyway. Is there a problem here? The guard's posture didn't change. No problem, ma'am. Just asking him to step back. He wasn't doing anything. Simone looked at the old man, really looked, the way people mostly didn't anymore, at the deep, careful creases at the corners of his eyes, at hands that had clearly done fine work for a very long time, at the canvas bag held like it mattered. Sir, are you all right? He met her eyes like it surprised him to be asked. I'm fine, he said. I only wanted to see the exhibit. I used to know this building. He's not on the list, the guard said, already reaching for his radio. Then put him on it, Simone said, and something in her own voice startled her, steady, certain, entirely unlike the 11 minutes and counting version of herself from 90 seconds ago. Or I'll walk him through myself. The guard hesitated. Somewhere behind the velvet rope, a woman murmured something to her companion that ended in a small, unkind laugh, quickly swallowed when nobody joined in. Simone didn't wait for permission. She offered her arm, the way you'd offer it to your own grandfather crossing an icy street, not performing kindness for the small audience now watching but simply doing the next necessary thing. Come on, she said. I'll show you the East Gallery. It's quieter in there anyway. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she almost asked if something was wrong, and then he took her arm, and let her lead him past the velvet rope, past the guard who'd already forgotten how to object, into the hush of white walls and track lighting beyond. Neither of them saw the man standing near the far end of the atrium, half-turned from a conversation he'd stopped following. Tall, black suit, a champagne glass he hadn't touched in the 4 minutes since he'd picked it up, which, for Beck Taemin, was practically an eternity. His assistant appeared at his elbow, tablet clutched to her chest. Sir, the board wants a photo before the unveiling. He wasn't listening. His eyes hadn't left the woman disappearing into the East Gallery with a man in a threadbare hanbok he hadn't seen inside this building in 12 years. Not yet, he said quietly, and started walking. Simone made it to the 9th floor conference room at 8:58 the next morning, blazer still creased from where it had hung too long over her desk chair, a paper cup of vending machine coffee going cold in her hand. She hadn't slept well. She kept replaying the way the old man's eyes had moved across the East Gallery the night before, Not browsing, studying, the way you look at something you built with your own hands and haven't been allowed to touch in a long time. She told herself it didn't matter. She had a new hire orientation to get through and a department head to impress. The room filled slowly, 12 other new hires, a stack of laminated building access forms, a woman near the coffee station introducing herself as Mira Han, communications, 3 years in, who leaned over during the seating shuffle and murmured, "You're the one from the gala." Simone's stomach dropped an inch. How does everyone already know that? Word travels fast in this building. Mira didn't smile, exactly, but something close to it moved at the corner of her mouth. Word travels at the speed of light, actually. Before Simone could ask what that meant, the door at the front of the room opened, and a hush moved through it the way water moves through a cracked glass, quiet, total, impossible to stop once it started. Baek Tae-min walked to the head of the table in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been born on him, and took the seat at its head without ceremony. But it wasn't him that made Simone's paper cup go still in her hand. It was the man who followed him in. Same worn gray hanbok. Same canvas bag, set down now beside a chair like it weighed nothing and everything. The old man from the East Gallery took the seat just behind and to the left of the chairman, not at the table, exactly, but close enough that no one in the room could pretend not to notice him. "Before we begin," the HR director said, flipping a page on her tablet without looking up, "the way people announce things they assume everyone already understands. I'd like to formally welcome Chairman Baek's father back to the building for today's session. Founder Baek Woon-sik." Nobody breathed for a second. Simone's coffee cup was very still. Founder. The word landed somewhere under her ribs and stayed there. He hadn't been a lost old man at the wrong gala. He'd been standing outside his own company's front doors, and a security guard hadn't let him in. Across the table, Taemin's eyes found hers for exactly 1 beat too long before he looked back down at his notes. "This is the part of the story where I have to break in for a second. Welcome to Soul Spoken Tales, where every story you're watching gets written from scratch, right here, for you. This one's about what happens when the people we're quick to walk past turn out to be the ones who could have changed everything. If that's ever happened to you, or if you've ever been the one nobody stopped for, drop where you're watching from, and what time it is right now." I read every one. Now, let's get back to it. The rest of orientation blurred past her in a haze of building maps and benefits packets. Baek Woon-sik said nothing about the gala. Said nothing about her at all, in fact, sat quietly through slides about visitor badges and floor access with an unreadable calm that gave away exactly as much as his sons had, across a lobby, 12 hours earlier. By the time the session ended, Simone genuinely couldn't tell whether she'd already made an enemy, an ally, or something she didn't have a name for yet, only that Baek Tae-min had watched her the entire last 20 minutes without once looking like he was watching her at all. The email arrived at 4:47 that afternoon, subject line blunt as a filing cabinet, reassignment, conservation review, Baek collection, effective immediately. Simone read it twice, standing at her desk, coffee forgotten, before Mira leaned over the partition with an expression somewhere between impressed and worried. "You've been on staff for 1 day, Mira said. Nobody gets pulled onto a chairman-level review their first week. Nobody gets pulled onto a chairman-level review their first year. Maybe it's a mistake." "It's not a mistake." Myra's voice dropped. "It's a message. I just can't tell yet if it's a good one." The conference room on the 12th floor was smaller than Simone expected, walls lined with climate-controlled cases holding pieces too fragile for the public galleries. Baek Tae-min was already there when she arrived, sleeves rolled with the same surgical precision she remembered from the gala, a stack of condition reports fanned across the table like a hand of cards he hadn't decided how to play. "Miss Carter." He didn't look up. "Sit. We're behind schedule." She sat. She did not, in fact, sit quietly. "This attribution is wrong," she said, 20 minutes later, tapping a report on a Joseon-era ink landscape slated for the spring exhibition. "The provenance chain skips 11 years. Somebody filled that gap with an assumption, not a record." That assumption was made by a senior authenticator with 30 years in this department. Then he's been wrong for 30 years, or he got lazy once and nobody checked his work because of the other 29. She held his gaze, surprised at her own nerve and unwilling to take it back. I'm not saying the piece is fake. I'm saying we don't actually know, and putting it in the exhibition catalog as known is a lie with good penmanship. Something shifted behind his eyes, not anger, exactly. Closer to a man recalculating the weight of a chair he'd assumed was empty. You could have raised this in writing, he said. Through the proper channel. I'm raising it now, out loud, in the room where it can still be fixed before it's printed. She sat back. You can have my job for it if you want. I'd still rather be right than careful. He didn't answer that. But he pulled the report back toward himself, and reread it, and did not put it back on the approved stack. Neither of them noticed Yoon Sang-cheol pause outside the glass wall of the conference room on his way past, didn't notice him slow his steps, didn't notice the particular stillness that came over him at the sight of the new hire leaning across the chairman's table like she belonged there, or the small, unhurried way he took out his phone and made a note before continuing down the hall, already composing, in his head, the first sentence of a story he hadn't decided yet how far he intended to tell. She found him by accident, or told herself it was an accident, a Tuesday lunch break spent wandering Insadong's narrow gallery street because the office kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and she needed 20 minutes where nobody was watching her calculate her own footing. He was sitting outside a tea shop on a stool too short for his frame, canvas bag beside him, a chipped cup of barley tea steaming untouched in front of him. You're following me, he said, without looking up, though the corner of his mouth suggested he didn't mind. I didn't know you'd be here. Simone stopped, suddenly unsure whether it was appropriate to sit down across from the founder of the company that employed her, then sat down anyway, because it felt ruder not to. I just needed some air. Sit. The tea is terrible. I still order it every week. Why? Because the woman who runs the shop has been terrible at making tea for 30 years, and terrible at it in exactly the same way every time. He finally looked at her, something warm moving behind the tired lines of his face. There's a comfort in things that don't change to impress you. She laughed before she meant to. He gestured for the shop owner to bring a second cup, and for a while they simply sat, the street moving around them, a delivery cart, two art students arguing over a canvas roll, the smell of roasting chestnuts from somewhere she couldn't see. You defended me at the door, he said eventually, not a question. Anyone would have. No. He said it plainly, without heat, the way you correct a fact rather than an opinion. Anyone did not. I have stood outside that building more than once this year. You are the first person who looked at me and saw a man, instead of a problem to be moved along. Simone didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't try to give one. He reached into the canvas bag and drew out a small object wrapped in cloth, turning it over once in his palm before setting it, without ceremony, into her open hand. It was a jade seal, cool and smooth, worn pale at one corner from decades of handling, the carved characters at its base too faint for her to read in the shifting light. What is this? A name seal. My father's, before it was mine. He closed her fingers gently over it, the gesture of a man who had done this before and would likely do it again. Not the important one. Keep this one close anyway. I don't understand. You will, he said, or you won't, and either way it will still mean something. He drank his terrible tea in one unhurried motion, and did not explain further, and somehow that felt like exactly the right amount of answer for a Tuesday in autumn neither of them would forget. The Conservation Archive lived 2 floors below ground, a windowless room of climate-locked cabinets and a particular hush of paper that had outlived everyone who'd first touched it. Simone had been assigned there for the afternoon, cross-referencing condition reports against acquisition records for the spring exhibition catalog, tedious work, the kind nobody senior wanted, which was exactly why it had landed on her desk. She almost missed it. Would have missed it, if she hadn't already learned, 3 years of her grandmother's quilting ledgers deep, that gaps in paperwork were never really gaps. They were places someone had decided not to look. The file was for a landscape scroll authenticated 11 years ago, the same piece, she realized slowly, that Taemin had pulled off the approved stack after her outburst in the review room. The provenance chain was clean for decades, meticulous even, right up until a 6-month stretch where the paper trail simply stopped and picked back up again with a new authentication stamp, dated, signed, Yoon Sang-cheol. She sat with that for a long moment. It wasn't proof of anything. Old records went missing all the time, fires, floods, a careless intern decades before she was born. But something about the cleanness of the gap, the way it opened and closed at exactly the moments convenient to close it, sat wrong in her chest the way an off-key note sits wrong in an otherwise perfect song. She photographed the file. She didn't know yet what she'd do with it. She only knew she wasn't going to forget it existed. She didn't notice, on her way back up to her desk, the second set of eyes that had already logged her extended visit to that particular drawer, a note added to a call log Yoon Sang-cheol kept with the same meticulous care he applied to everything else, 3 lines long, time-stamped, filed under a name that wasn't hers yet but soon would be. By the following morning, the whispers had already started, quiet enough that Simone didn't hear the first ones directly. Mira did. Someone saying you got the Beck review assignment because Mira hesitated over lunch, stirring her noodles without eating them, choosing her words the way you choose a path through broken glass. Because you're getting close to the family. That it's not really about the work. That's not, Simone started, and stopped, because outrage wasn't going to fix anything and she knew it. I know, Mira said. I'm just telling you what's moving through the building. It moves fast here. Faster than the truth, usually. Simone thought of the jade seal sitting in her coat pocket, cool and small and entirely without explanation, and wondered, for the first time since Insadong, whether accepting it had been a kindness she'd received freely or a debt somebody else intended to make her pay. The formal complaint reached HR on a Thursday and signed 3 paragraphs of careful, deniable language about concerns regarding preferential treatment and the appearance of impropriety in staff-family relations. Simone found out about it the way she'd found out about everything else in this building, secondhand, through Mira, delivered with the particular gentleness people use when they're about to make your week worse. They're not firing you, Mira said quickly, before Simone's face could finish falling. They can't, not without cause. But it's in your file now. And once something's in the file, it's in the file. Simone sat with that in the stairwell for a long time before she found herself outside Taemin's office, knocking harder than she meant to. You've seen it, she said, before he could say anything at all. He didn't pretend not to understand. I've seen it. Then say something. 1 sentence, from you, and it disappears. You know it's not true. You know exactly where it's coming from. It's not that simple. He said it evenly, the way he said everything, but there was something underneath it now, something she hadn't heard from him before, hesitation dressed up as caution. It's exactly that simple. Her arms folded across her chest, less to hold her ground than to hold herself together. You just don't want to spend the capital. He didn't answer fast enough. That was the whole answer, really, the silence stretching a beat too long, long enough for her to read every calculation moving behind his eyes, every weighing of a young hire's reputation against 30 years of bored relationships he'd spent his entire tenure carefully not disturbing. She was already turning for the door by the time he found words at all. Simone, don't. She didn't raise her voice. That was somehow worse than if she had. I misjudged what kind of man you were. That's on me, not you. The door closed quietly behind her, which somehow landed harder than if she'd slammed it. He sat alone afterward for a long time, staring at the report still open on his desk, the same landscape scroll, the same gap in the provenance she'd flagged 3 weeks ago, still unresolved, still sitting exactly where caution had left it. He thought about his father, standing outside a set of glass doors in a hanbok 12 years too worn, and a version of himself that had once promised, quietly, never to be the kind of man who let people vanish rather than spend something to keep them. He didn't call her back that night. He told himself it was strategy, that moving too fast would only feed the story instead of ending it. He didn't entirely believe himself, and that, more than anything, was what kept him awake. Baek Woon-sik didn't come to Insadong on Tuesday. Simone waited 25 minutes at the tea shop before the owner, wiping down the counter without being asked, said quietly, "He didn't come yesterday either." Not alarmed, exactly, the woman had known him 30 years and had learned not to be alarmed easily, but watchful in a way that made Simone's stomach tighten before she understood why. She went looking that evening, retracing the small loop of his usual week: the tea shop, a bench near the loading dock where he sometimes fed the pigeons, a corner table in the staff cafeteria he favored despite the terrible coffee. All empty. All undisturbed in a way that felt less like absence than like something deliberately left behind. It was Taemin who found the workbench. He hadn't set foot in his father's old restoration studio in years, a small room on the 6th floor, kept exactly as it had been, that nobody had the authority or the nerve to reassign. He went there that night on instinct he didn't examine too closely, and found the desk lamp still burning, a half-finished repair laid out with surgical care, and beside it, wrapped in the same cloth Simone had seen in Insadong, the second seal. Untouched. Set down, not dropped, deliberately, the way a man leaves something behind when he means for it to be found. His father never left work unfinished. 12 years running this company had taught Taemin exactly one unbreakable fact about Baek Woon-sik: he did not walk away from things mid-motion. Not restorations. Not conversations. Not, until the doors closed on him 12 years ago, the company itself. He called security. He called every hospital within a 30-minute radius himself, voice flat and controlled in a way that fooled no one who actually knew him, because underneath the control was something closer to panic than he'd allowed himself to feel in a decade. He canceled the board meeting scheduled for the following morning, something he had not done once in his tenure as chairman, and when his assistant asked, carefully, whether she should reschedule, he only said, "Not yet," and went back to staring at a phone that refused to ring. Simone showed up at his office near midnight, and neither of them mentioned the conversation from 3 days earlier. There wasn't room for it anymore. It had been swallowed whole by something larger. "He's gone," she said, and it wasn't a question. "He's gone," Taemin agreed, and for the first time since the gala, he looked, entirely, like a son instead of a chairman. What no one at Baek Fine Arts Group knew, what neither Simone nor Taemin would learn until much later, was that Baek Woon-sik hadn't vanished. He'd left on purpose, alone, before anyone could bury a second thing the way the first had already been buried. He went first to an old friend. Bang Chulmin had carved seals for 3 generations of souls collecting families before his hands grew too unsteady for the work, and he'd known Woon-sik since they were both young men arguing over inkstone quality in a shop that no longer existed. He opened his door in Incheon just past midnight, took one look at his old friend's face, and asked no questions before pulling a locked cabinet out from beneath a workbench that hadn't moved in 20 years. "I always thought someone should keep a copy," Bang said, sliding a thin folder across a table scarred with decades of carving work. "I didn't think I'd live long enough for it to matter." Inside were impressions, dozens of them, pressed in wax and ink over the years, a private archive of every seal Bang had ever authenticated or refused to authenticate for the Baek family collection. Near the back, dated 11 years prior, was an impression that didn't match the one now sitting in the official acquisition file for the landscape scroll Simone had flagged. 2 different seals. One real. One that had replaced it, quietly, in a 6-month gap no one had thought worth explaining. From there it was 3 more days of careful, unhurried movement, the kind that couldn't be rushed without being noticed. A retired notary in Mapo who remembered a stamp used without her signature ever leaving her office. A bank clerk, long since moved on to other work, who recalled a signature that never should have cleared as easily as it had. Each piece small on its own. Together, a shape Woon-sik had spent 12 years refusing to let himself see clearly, because seeing it clearly would have meant admitting how deliberately it had been done to him. He slept badly. He ate less than he should have. He called no one, because the moment he surfaced, the people who'd buried this the first time would know exactly what he was doing, and move to bury it again before he could finish. 4 days. 4 days that felt, to both Simone and Taemin, like watching a story end on its worst possible page. Then he came back, not in the worn gray hanbok, but in a tailored suit that fit him the way it must have once, before he'd stopped letting himself take up that much space, carrying a folder thick with bank transfers, a mismatched seal impression, and a signature that had never legally cleared the way the official record claimed it had. "I found it," was all he said, standing in his son's doorway. Taemin, who had not cried since his mother's funeral, had to turn away for a moment before he could speak at all. Taemin called Yoon Sang-cheol into his office at 7 the next morning, before the floor filled, before anyone else could witness whatever this conversation turned out to be. He set the folder on the desk between them without preamble and watched his father's oldest colleague read it in silence, watched the exact moment recognition crossed his face and then, just as quickly, smoothed itself back into something composed. "Where did you find this?" Yoon said. "Not a question. A door closing. Does it matter?" "It matters whether you understand what you're holding." Yoon sat, unbidden, in the chair across from him, folding his hands with the same measured calm he'd used in 1,000 board meetings. "Your father was drowning this company in sentiment. Contracts he wouldn't sign because he liked the seller too much to negotiate hard. Acquisitions he blocked because a piece deserved to stay where it was. 12 years ago, we were 4 months from insolvency, Taemin. I did not forge anything that wasn't already fiction, I simply gave the board a version of events they could act on before we lost everything. You destroyed his name to save the company. I saved the company." Yoon's voice didn't rise. "That was somehow worse than if it had. And it worked. Look around you. Everything you built in 12 years, you built on ground I cleared for you." Taemin sat with that a long moment, and found, to his own surprise, that he didn't entirely disagree with the diagnosis, only with everything Yoon had decided he had the right to do about it. "You didn't ask him," he said finally. "You didn't ask me. You decided, alone, that a lie was more efficient than trusting either of us to fix it honestly. Honesty is expensive. I chose efficient. You also decided a junior authenticator's career was worth spending to protect that lie a second time." Taemin's voice hardened for the first time in the conversation. "That's not a business decision, Yoon. That's just cruelty with better paperwork." Yoon didn't answer that. For the first time, something in his composure genuinely faltered, not guilt, exactly, but the dawning, uncomfortable recognition that the story he'd told himself for 12 years might not survive contact with someone unwilling to accept it on his terms. "What happens now?" Yoon asked quietly. "Now," Taemin said, closing the folder, "you're going to hear the truth said out loud, in a room full of the people who trusted your version of it. Whether you're still standing in that room afterward is entirely up to you." He found his father in the 6th floor studio an hour later, and Simone with him, the three of them silent for a moment in the small room that had waited 12 years to be used again. "There's going to be a meeting," Taemin said. "Monday. Everyone." Woon-sik looked at his son for a long moment, then reached into his coat and pressed a warm roasted chestnut into each of their palms without a word, the way, Simone was beginning to understand, he always did when something had finally settled into place. The atrium filled early Monday morning, employees packed shoulder to shoulder beneath the same oversized calligraphy scroll that had watched over the gala 6 months before, floor after floor summoned without explanation, murmuring about layoffs, about mergers, about anything except the truth, because no one had guessed it correctly yet. Simone stood near the back, half convinced she'd be escorted out before the meeting ended. Some of the faces near the front, a woman who'd once wrinkled her nose at the doors, a guard reassigned since the gala, stood scattered through the crowd, oblivious to what was coming for them. Baek Woon-sik walked onto the small stage in the tailored suit, the one that finally fit him the way power fits a man who stopped hiding from it. room went silent in waves, recognition rippling backward through the crowd as people placed him, not from the tea shop, not from the loading dock, but from the framed portrait in the lobby they'd walked past every day without looking up. Founder, the introduction said. Former chairman. My father. Nobody breathed. Near the front, a junior associate who'd once laughed at an old man's cane went pale in real time, visibly connecting the beggar from the gala doors to the man now standing under his own portrait. A company is not measured by its profits, Woonsik said, his voice carrying farther than his frame suggested it could. It's measured by how it treats people who can't do anything for it in return. He let that settle. For years I built this place, and somewhere along the way I convinced myself a title was a kind of shield. I was wrong twice. Once, when someone I trusted decided a lie was more efficient than the truth. And once, years before that, when I let myself believe success meant I no longer had to look people in the eye. He didn't name anyone. He told one story, the gala doors, the guard, the woman who'd asked a question nobody else in that lobby had the courage to ask out loud. An old man in a worn coat taught me more about this company's future in one evening than a decade of board meetings ever did, he said. Not because of what I said to her. Because of what she chose to do when everyone else chose to look away. Then he asked Simone Carter to come forward. She didn't move at first, didn't fully understand, for 3 full seconds, that he meant her, until Taemin, standing at the edge of the stage, found her eyes across the room and nodded once, the way you'd reassure someone stepping onto ice you already knew would hold. She walked to the stage in a silence broken only by her own footsteps, hundreds of eyes on her, her pulse loud in her own ears. Woonsik took both her hands. This is the only person in this building who treated me the same on the worst day of my life as she did every day after, he said. She didn't know who I was. That's exactly why it mattered. Then, before anyone in the atrium fully understood what they were watching, he bowed to her, fully, from the waist, the deep bow reserved for people who'd earned something no title could purchase. A founder bowing to a junior authenticator in front of every executive who had ever looked past her. Several people gasped audibly. For many of them, it was more shocking than anything he'd said. She resigned that same week. She set the letter on Taemin's desk herself, folded once, on a Thursday morning while HR was still quietly scrubbing the anonymous complaint from her file and the executives who'd filed it were suddenly discovering urgent reasons to be traveling for the foreseeable future. She hadn't come to gloat. She hadn't come out of anger, either. She simply needed to say the thing out loud, in front of him, rather than let him assume it. You don't have to do this, he said, before she'd even finished setting the envelope down. Whatever they said about you, it's over. You could stay. You could have any position in this building you wanted. That's exactly why I have to leave. She kept her voice even, though it cost her something too. If I stay now, everyone will think I did all of it on purpose. The gala. Your father. All of it, that I somehow knew it would end up here. You didn't know. I know that. You know that. She met his eyes. But I needed to have never been about this, Taemin. I helped him because he reminded me of my grandmother's neighbor, the one everybody stopped visiting once he got old and slow. Not because I wanted anything. Not a title. Not this. She gestured at the space beyond his window, the atrium below, still faintly humming with the aftermath of Monday's meeting. I need you to actually know that, not just believe it. He was quiet for a long moment, standing there with the thing he'd been circling for weeks without letting himself land on it. Everything she'd ever done, for his father, for the guard who'd once turned Woonsik away and later apologized to her directly, for strangers who had nothing to offer her in return, she would have done for anyone. It had never been a performance he'd simply caught the tail end of. It was who she was, straight through, with nothing held back for an audience. It should have made him feel foolish for hoping, quietly, that some part of it had been about him. Instead, it made him love her more than he'd let himself admit until that exact moment. He didn't ask her to stay again. He didn't offer a bigger title, or a public apology dressed up as a grand gesture, He'd learned, finally, that those were exactly the currencies she didn't trade in. "If you leave," he said instead, quiet, steady, the words costing him more than anything he'd said in the atrium all week, "I'll spend however long it takes proving this company deserves someone like you anyway. Not to bring you back. Just because it should." For the first time since the gala doors, she didn't see the chairman standing in front of her. She saw the man underneath him, finally standing still. Spring came to Seoul quietly that year, the way it does after a winter nobody enjoyed, cherry blossoms along the Cheonggyecheon, the tea shop in Insadong finally repainting its sign after 20 years of putting it off. Simone spent those months teaching English to residents at a small community center near her apartment, telling herself, on the nights it didn't quite feel true, that leaving Beck Fine Arts Group had been the right call. Taemin never called to pressure her back. He sent, exactly once a month, a short note, no requests, no guilt folded into the wording, just a small update on something that had changed at the company. A conservation ethics policy, quietly rewritten. A new visitor protocol that guaranteed basic dignity to anyone who walked through the doors, regardless of what they were wearing when they did. A junior associate, the same one who'd gone pale in the atrium, signed up, apparently, to volunteer at the very community center where Simone taught, though whether he knew that or simply got lucky, nobody had confirmed. She came back in April, not because of any of it, and also, somehow, because of all of it. Not the title waiting for her. Not the raise HR had quietly authorized without being asked. She came back because the company had actually changed, in the small unglamorous ways that don't make it into press releases, because she believed, finally, in what it had become, rather than in what it owed her. She found Woon-sik and Taemin waiting for her at the same doors where it had all started, the gala's velvet rope long since taken down, an ordinary Tuesday morning moving around them. "If you'd known who he was that first night," Taemin asked, standing beside her while the glass doors slid open onto the lobby, "would you still have stopped?" She smiled, the kind that reached her eyes before it reached her mouth. "I'd have stopped even longer." He laughed, really laughed, the rare, unguarded kind that creased the corners of his eyes, the kind people in that building would later say they'd never once seen from him before that year. Woon-sik reached into his coat, the same coat, a little less worn now, and pulled out 3 roasted chestnuts, pressing one into each of their palms without a word, the way he always did when something in a moment had settled a question he didn't feel like explaining out loud. Simone closed her hand around the warm shell and understood, finally, exactly what it meant, and had for longer than she'd realized. In her other pocket, worn smooth from months of handling, sat the small jade seal he'd given her that first Tuesday in Insadong, not the important one, he'd told her then. She understood now that he'd been wrong. It had been the important one all along. It simply hadn't been the real one, and it hadn't needed to be, to matter. The story ended where it began, at a set of glass doors. Except this time, they weren't keeping anyone out. They were opening onto 3 people walking in together. Woon-sik held the doors a moment longer than he needed to, letting the 3 of them stand there together in the ordinary morning light, no cameras, no board waiting upstairs, just chestnut shells warming in 3 pairs of hands. "I wrote this one thinking about what actually holds a family, or a company, or a person's name, together after something tries hard to break it apart. Not the grand gesture on the stage, the small, unremarkable choice made when nobody's keeping score. A seal kept in a coat pocket for 12 years. A cup of terrible tea, ordered anyway, every single week. Do you think Yoon Sang-cheol ever really believed he was protecting the company, or was that just the story he needed to survive believing about himself? And if you'd been the one standing at those doors that first night, with everyone else already walking past, would you have stopped? If this one stayed with you the way it stayed with me, I've got another story just like it waiting. Stick around, I'd love for you to be there for it."